Hello, welcome back to Legal Information Resources. Today we're going to be talking about legislation, so statutes, which are also referred to as laws, um, statutes, articles, acts, codes. Um, they're basically the products, the end product of the legislative process, which is kind of an iterative process where a bill starts out and it gets evaluated and debated and analyzed. And so it goes through changes, amended, and then finally it is either passed or it just dies. Usually they die in committee, which means that they get assigned to a committee, they don't go any further. So a lot of laws don't make it all the way, or a lot of bills don't make it all the way through the process and don't become laws. Those we'll look later, we'll look a little bit at it today, but we'll really concentrate on, we're doing a whole class on legislative history, which talks about how to trace that law back and how to pull up the products of that process as opposed to the end result, which is the bill that's passed into law. So legislature. So what we're going to cover, there's very few slides here. It's very dense though, so you may have lots of questions, and I'll upload the version of this without video that has lots of links to resources to look at. I always cover this. I started covering this later in the semester because it's just more complicated to me than cases, but you may find that not to be the case. So we'll cover statutes, we'll go briefly into legislative history and look at where you can conduct and how you can conduct a legislative history, which is tracing that bill back along the process to becoming a law. So this is a review. Statutes or laws are primary sources. So what are they? They are the law. So there's other things that are the law, but a lot of times when people talk about the law or the laws, they're really referring to statutes. So whenever you are doing a legal research question, you should always ask yourself, is there a statute? It's one of the first questions, is there a statute that applies to this behavior? And sometimes that statute is a state statute, so state law would apply. And determining whether state or federal law applies is itself a research question. And it may be a local ordinance, which is kind of the local version. It's usually passed by a city council, but it's a similar process. It's a little bit less involved. But generally, when people talk about laws, they're talking about state and federal statutes or international statutes, which international processes are very similar. There's usually some kind of local or provincial body, and then there's usually some kind of central government body. And, you know, it's a little bit different. Like sometimes they're unicameral, which means they're just one. There's not two sides like we have where we have the Senate and the House. I think there's one state in the US that has a unicameral, which just means there's just one House. So what weight do laws have? They have, they're pretty high up there. They're just below constitutions. So they're mandatory within the jurisdiction in which they are passed, and then they can be persuasive outside. So if there's no statute in the state of Kansas, and you really want to persuade the judge that this behavior is should be treated a certain way, you can look at state statutes outside of your jurisdiction. It's a little bit, it's not as persuasive as case law, I think, because there's this idea that, well, if our state wanted to pass a law, they would. So, I mean, that's the way I look at it. It's not quite as persuasive if it's outside the jurisdiction. So where can I find them? So you can find them in print, and they're available in volumes, and we'll look to see what those volumes look like. Or they're going to be on Westlaw, Lexis, and other online providers. So you're going to be able to find them. And they're also free online. So most states have the state statutes, and then the federal statutes are going to be available. Places like FindLaw, places like Congress.gov, even though that's where we find the legislative history. I believe they also have copies of the statutes. Now, those free resources are not going to have annotated versions. So you're going to find annotated versions on Westlaw, Lexis, Bloomberg Law, Wolters Kluwer, places like that. And by annotated, that means they have resources or other references attached to them. So it's like a big cheat sheet for doing research. So, for example, and I think I did a video about this, but those videos were so fast. If you have a statute, after the statute, they're going to list a bunch of references that you're going to want to look at. They'll list secondary resource references. So anytime that statute is mentioned in a book about this particular kind of law, they'll have a reference to that. And because West publishes most of this stuff, the West is going to cite to West resources. Lexis the same way, but I find that I actually haven't researched this, so I don't know how much they cite their own rather than others. That's a really good question. And then the really important part is they're going to cite to the cases. So they're going to have references to, they're going to have little blurbs of all the cases that dealt with that statute. So it is a very easy way of doing research, is to look up the statute and then, say the statute is the controlling behavior. You look up the statute and then you look at all the cases that have dealt with it. There you have your instant research. Similarly, when you're looking online, if you have a citation for a statute, you can plug that citation in. It will pull up the statute, but it will also pull up all of the citing references and anything sort of cited by cited. So you're going to have like this huge collection, and these are called KeyCite reports, or in Lexis Shepard's reports. And Bloomberg has their own, which is called BCite, I believe, and it's very similar. So it's basically, if you have the citation, you plug it in, you get lists of cases, and they're actually organized. So they've actually rated the cases by how much, how in depth they cover, and then how much, whether they're good or bad, the treatment is favorable or not favorable. So there's a lot there, and those are considered citators. So you pull up those reports and you have that information. You can also just go into regular Westlaw from those citators or from the actual document itself. So when you go into the statute, after the statute, there's going to be all of that annotated material that you can click the links on. So it's very, very handy to do it electronically. But the print functions the same way. It's just that it will have a reference. You have to go to another set. So laws are primary sources. I believe this is also a review. So they're basically rules of conduct or behavior. That's really general, but they are considered the primary source. This is one of the major routes of making law, legislation. We've already talked about case law. Legislative history is not the law, but it may be persuasive authority. So if you have products from earlier in the, like a bill analysis or a transcript of a floor debate or a committee debate, or a bill analysis that was done in committee, that information can be helpful in how you want the judge to interpret the law. So it can be sort of evidence that um, the Congress intended for the meaning of these words to be this. So it can be helpful. I've found though that when attorneys are usually trying to look for legislative history, it's because it's sort of the last ditch effort. They are either not able to find relevant resources that talk about what they need to be interpreted, or the sources are all not in their favor. So it's a little bit, and you should know that because at this point they're usually pretty cranky. That's probably an overgeneralization, but there is a kind of desperation to legislative research, and also they don't know how to do it because you don't learn it in law school, and it's pretty rare that attorneys do it, at least in most kinds of litigation. So they're usually relying on the librarian to explain it to them and to take them through the process. So that's why we have to study it, because you are going to be the expert in it, even though you don't know what it is yet. So I'm self-taught on this. So if you know more, or if you have insights, please correct me or give me guidance, because I think we're just all in this together. I had a student actually who covered legislative history, and I've asked her permission to share she did this as her end of class presentation, and she worked at the state law library. So, or maybe she worked at the legislative, did she work? I can't remember, I'll find out. But I'll share her PowerPoints because I find them to be helpful. So finding aids, those are considered secondary sources. So finding aids would be the annotations themselves. So you have the statutes, but any of the annotations, that's not going to be, it may refer you to law, but like the blurbs and all of the sort of summary material, that is going to be considered secondary, and you probably shouldn't cite it. It's used just to find the law. Now, if it's a book that talks about the law, that's a secondary resource that you can cite. Generally in law, though, it's a little bit backwards from doing scholarly research. In scholarly research, you're usually expected to cite to the place you found the information, so the sort of most recent source that where you found it, not to the original source, so you don't jump over the people who've built this scholarship. But in law, you don't really cite that finding place. You don't always cite, usually just cite straight to the primary resource, and you may add some information if it's really helpful, but there's not that sense of plagiarism or stealing ideas, or you don't have to cite where you found this information. You just have to cite to the primary authority. That's a little bit different, and it will change the way you do research, really. So primary, that's if you come from a humanities background or social science background, these terms just mean something different. So we talked a little bit more about, this is review as well, mandatory authority versus persuasive authority. Statutes are going to be mandatory within their jurisdiction, that's pretty much what you need to know. The court's got to follow it. If it's in that state, that's the state statute. They can't come up with some new law. They can interpret the statute in a different way, but it is binding on them. So what you'll usually see is they will say they have to rule a certain way, and then it's up to the legislature to change the law if they may not agree with the result. They may say this is a strange result, but we're bound by this authority. So statutes. So they're called different things: law, statute, legislation, acts. So when they first are passed, they're usually in an act. It's kind of how the bill slowly makes its way through and becomes an act. And then after they're in an act, right? And so they're passed as an act, but there is the existing law is usually organized in a code, so sort of topically. So in the legislation, it will say where the changes that have been made by the act are going to go in the code. So some acts are very complicated and very large. So like the Patriot Act, I've used this as an example before, but it's not something that you can just read. Like if you go and pull the Patriot Act and you start reading it, it's just a bunch of amendments to existing laws. So it doesn't make sense. You have to know the context. You know, they'll just add a phrase here and there, or a line, and so you can't read it and make sense of it, most of it. So what you have to do is look back at the code and see the changes. So you can take the Patriot Act and see the changes that it made to existing law and look at it that way. So think of acts as really just being the actual law that's being changed. The code is existing law and then the new law within it. It's hard to sort of explain how it is, but when you look at codes, it makes so much more sense. The code is kind of the final product. All of the laws, new and existing, they're all there. The acts are the thing that changes and makes changes to that existing law. Now, an act can come in and just be completely, like if there's no statute on the books on this topic, and they come in and decide we're going to legislate on this topic, here it is, they just roll it out in one big swoop. And then it just goes right into the code. Sometimes it works like that, or sometimes they want to just get rid of all the old law, so they just basically repeal all the old law and just replace it with this whole new thing. And that gets really complicated because you have to you look at tables to see, well, which part of the new law used to be covered in the old law. And usually it's in print, it's dealt with in tables. It's tracked usually as like note material in the statutes online. And a lot of times it's linked, so or hyperlinked, so you can just jump out. That's when it's best. If you're looking at free resources, it becomes difficult and you have to actually look at the reference and then go back to another source, look it up and see the reference. It's legislative history without the aid of pay resources is difficult. In Texas, it's quite simple because we have a really, really robust legislative history. The bill files are all been digitized and placed online. It's a really great resource. So that's one reason I like to teach it, because it's pretty simple. It's very complicated to understand, but it's very simple to do. The resources are there. So the process of the code, so the law, statute, legislation, act, code, those are all like the law, right? And then the process documents, they can be called a bill. So it's kind of pre-law, legislative history, bill analysis, committee report, conference report. Those are the sort of intermediary products. They don't have the weight of law. And those are all gathered in what's called a bill file. And it used to be a file, right? It used to be a file folder. Now it's just an electronic kind of package. And other terms you should know are title, chapter, subchapter, section, and article. And those are going to be sort of the organization of the code or the statutes. Codes usually have titles, and that is instead of volumes. So it's going to be multi-volumes within one title. So title, title, I'm trying to think of a good one that I know. I don't really have them memorized anymore. We'll just make one up. So title 11 will cover, copyrights or something. I know that's not true, but I think it covers like Indian lands or something, and it's still called Indian lands, like they haven't changed the wording. But that might be multiple volumes within that title. So that's, I think, why they don't call it volume. multi volumes, right? And then, so within that, you're going to have chapters. You'll have a chapter on one sort of topic, and then subchapters within that topic, and then sections. Sections usually refer to an actual sort of the statute, like one sort of phrase of the statute. And an article can also refer to that same thing. So it just depends on your jurisdiction whether that single idea is referred to as an article or a section. Here's some really great resources for federal legislative research, this LSU Law Center Guide. For Texas, this Texas Legislative Research Library Intent Guide is really helpful. It will tell you how to do it. And then there's links to federal committee reports, historical Texas statutes, and then I can't quite see this, but U.S. Code and Statutes Guide, another good resource that I found recently. In the photos, you can see this right here. This picture is the United States statutes at large, and that is where the federal statutes come out and are printed in chronological order as they are passed. And then this U.S. Congressional and Administrative News, that's where the legislative history is going to be published for federal. It's a little bit easier in federal because it is published in a print volume. It's a little bit easier to understand. Now, not everything that is in a bill file will make it into that. That UScan is what we call it, but most everything is, and most everything important. Westlaw and Lexis both have this electronically. It's actually easier to understand, I think, in print than electronically. It's just good to visualize that it's published in order that it happens. So it's a weird organization, I think, but that's because law is made all the time. That's just the easiest way to do it. And then these are, behind it are the supplement pamphlets. So before it gets put into a bound volume, you'll have loads of these on the shelf. So bill becomes a law. This is just a general way that it works. It works in Texas this way, and I believe it works this way in the federal government. I imagine that there are some states that may call these things different things. And I haven't done legislative history outside of Texas except for federal, so it may be more difficult in some states. I'm really not sure about all the states. So this will be interesting to learn with our class. So a bill is introduced and a bill file is created, and that's usually introduced by a congressman and a senator. And there's usually two they're the same identical bill will be introduced simultaneously. This is usually how it's done in the House and in the Senate. And then they will kind of run, and then it's at one point they'll one version will be more successful than the other, and they'll actually what they do is they kind of merge them, and that is called something. That's got like a term of art. It'll come to me. So, but they're introduced, right? And then they're assigned, in each house, they're assigned a committee. So based on topic. So that happens right away. And then it basically, so on the floor, it will get introduced, and that just means it's read. The whole thing isn't read, I don't believe, just the title and the summary, right? And you can go watch these floor recordings are all available online now, and you can even watch them live. Very boring. I've had to watch them for work to try to find legislative history. So you can go and watch and see this sort of process happen. So they're announced, and then I forget how they get assigned to a committee who decides that, then that's basically all that happens. And then they go to the committee. So the next time the committee meets, they'll have a number of these bills to discuss. Sometimes they're just tabled and they don't discuss them, and that's the end of it. But if they make it through committee, and the committee will hold hearings on it, and will they may have speakers, so they may have people who are for this bill or against this bill, or experts come and talk about it. So they'll have those kind of hearings in committee, and they usually will have, some of the products could be, they might ask for a budget report. So how will this affect the budget? When you introduce a bill, you're supposed to say how it will affect the budget. So sometimes they will send it out to the budget agency of Congress, and I think they're called different things. I forget what they're called in Texas. And that agency will, or that division will create a budget report that basically says, this is how it would affect the budget. So that will be in the bill file. And then the committee itself will usually write some kind of report, and that will be their bill analysis that they'll have. And that's also information that is considered legislative history. So after it's in committee, it is voted on in a committee, and it can be amended in committee as well. So you'll have these different versions. So that version may get passed. It may have changed from the introduced version, and then it goes to the floor and is voted on the floor, and it can be amended on the floor of that house. And then you'll have floor debates, which are open debates about the bill, and it can be amended at that time, and that will be a version. And then if it passes, it will go to the other house. And then it's assigned to a committee. It goes to a conference committee, and they make a conference report, and that's where they merge the law, and then it basically gets discussed again and debated again on the floor, and then it can pass. And then once it passes, it gets signed by either the governor or the president, and it becomes a law. And sometimes the executive, the president or the governor, doesn't want to sign it. It can go back and get passed by a greater margin and become a law anyway. I'm not really up on this part of civics. I'm just telling you what I think you need to know to understand the organization of the bill file and what all the different parts of it are. And also to understand a little bit more about statutes and what all of the references are that you'll see attached to statutes. Like, what is all that? Most of that information, the citation information that comes after the statute in a book or in Westlaw, that's information about that process. So this is just some information, and it kind of is cut off. So I'll refer you back to the PowerPoint version of this. In federal, the first version that is published of the law is called Public Law Number XXXYYY, and that's published as a slip law by the Government Publishing Office, and then it goes into U.S. statutes of law. So a slip law is just basically like a slip of paper, that's why, and it's just a little pamphlet. That's how it's first published. And then it gets published in the U.S. statutes at large in chronological order. And I think Amy pointed out that this XXX equals the number of the Congress. And there's a chart somewhere online that says what Congress we're in at any one time. So we're at some kind of Congress. They don't call it the 2020 Congress. They call it whatever number it's been since we started. And then the YYY portion will be the number of the law in chronological order that it was passed. So it's not, that's before it even goes to the code. So then it gets put in the code. And it's going to be in all these places. So that's the thing, it gets published all these places. So sometimes if you can't find it in one place, like the volume is missing, you can just go to the other place, right? You can just go to U.S. statutes at large. That's a shortcut. Librarian, like super secret, it's simultaneously in all these places. And then the state in Texas, when it's first passed, it's called a session law. So, and then we have volumes that are called general and special laws. Not every library has these because it's really redundant, right? Because they're going to be published here, but they're also going to end up in the codes. But for legislative history, it can be really helpful to have these volumes because of the way that they're organized. Because all of the references to the laws are going to be to the session law. And so this is what I'm talking about right here, this XX, that's the number of the legislature. That would be the regular session chapter. And then that's the original session law. And if you look at general and special laws, you can see it's just easy to find. You can find it right away because you just go to the volume you need for that legislative session. And Texas is the same way. Legislatures, we have them every 2 years, so it's a little wonky, right? We've had less. And then regular session is like the called session, or the regular session is the session that you start out with, and then they can call sessions after that, and those will be called special called sessions. So they'll be C, and they will have numbers after them because sometimes they call 2. So I think occasionally they'll call 3, which basically just means we didn't pass all the stuff that the governor wants you to pass. He calls you back to work, and you have to work some more. And all that material gets put into a different little volume. And then they get codified in Verna's, which is our codes annotate. So this is what the session law looks like when it first comes out. They're little pamphlets. Every legislative session, which is every 2 years, you'll get these, and they'll be a different color. So it makes it a little bit easier. Once again, those are in chronological order. Which topically it makes it a little bit different. You have to know what you're looking for to use these. The codes are a little different. They're organized topically, and they have table of contents and indexes, which can be very helpful. So the U.S. States Code. So I just want to talk a little bit about the citation. We talked a little bit about citation, but it helps to just break it down again. In a way, this is review. The United States Code is the official citation. And you can get this at the GPO, which used to be called the Government Printing Office, and their name is now changed to the Government Publishing Office. You can use the USCA, and the A is annotated, or the USCS, which is for service, and that's Lexis. So libraries typically either have the West version or the Lexis version, and it's pretty much the same. It's just Lexis uses their sort of reference system, and West uses its key number system. So it's very similar. So this first, for this USC breakdown, the first number is the title. So it's kind of like volume, but like I explained before, titles are a little bit broader than volume. And this is a section symbol. It's only used in law to my knowledge, and there is some macro to get it. It's pretty deep in symbols, though. Usually you have to go to 2 levels of symbols to get it on your keyboards. So I usually copy it and paste it, or make a macro. Then you'll have a paragraph, then you'll have the section number, and then in parentheticals you'll have the paragraph within the section, and it can get very deep. So it can go A1, B6, 5, it's just like, it can be deep to get down to sort of the unit that you're wanting, the actual part of the law that applies. Just be aware. Sometimes you're like, oh, well, think I'm at the right place, but you really have to make sure your citation is, all those little things matter. In Texas, we use Vernon's. So it's a black set with gold lettering, and it's called Vernon's Texas Codes Annotated and Vernon's Texas Civil Statutes. And this is one reason I don't do statutes first, because in Texas, we have codes, but not all the laws, not all the statutes have been codified. Some are still in statutes, and they are in the civil statutes, and they're still law, but they just haven't, the legislature just hasn't made them into a code. So they hang out in Texas civil statutes. And even more confusing, within the Texas civil statutes are some codes. So makes no sense. I think they're making progress in moving things over, but for a really long time, the probate code was actually in the Texas civil statutes, I believe. I believe that's accurate. So it's just like all of that. There's actually Congress people in the Texas legislature who every year they try to make progress on getting rid of old laws that are no good and making everything, just cleaning it up, basically. I forget what they call it, but they basically just try to make changes to clean it up. But of course, always they're passing more laws, it's getting sort of messier. So it's sort of endless work. I think it's really interesting that the people who do this are, the leaders are women. I used to pet sit for one of the legislators who does this work just by some weird coinkydink when I lived in Plano when I was a kid. But I think it's funny that women are doing that cleanup work. Very interesting. And that may not be the case anymore, but it was for a really long time. So I like the Texas Tech School of Law on Vernon's, very good. There is a free online version of the Texas codes and the civil statutes. It is difficult to search. You can do it, but it doesn't have annotations. And generally, it will just, if you plug in a citation, it will put you at the beginning of the whole thing, so you have to scroll down. Also, it doesn't have hyperlinks within it. And you can browse it. It is possible to browse, but it's a little bit difficult to find the browse feature. It's just not, it's not that user-friendly. And then there's this thing called Index to Sections Effective, which we will go, it's very handy. It's on the legislature's website. It helps you when you are trying to figure out what's going to be affected in your codes and your statutes by the laws that are up for being passed, and vice versa. Handy tool. We'll cover it more when we talk about legislative history. So that is everything. Now I know that that's a lot, and you probably still don't really know what a statute is, but I'll answer your questions and we will look at some, and I think that will help. So thank you very much.